Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Shelf. I am Shannon, and today I have a special guest, Mark, who has his own channel, Book Ramble. I've definitely mentioned his channel before. I will put the link to his channel in the description. Feel free to check that out. But today I'm mostly talking to him not as a fellow booktuber, although he is a great booktuber as well, and mostly talking about his role as author. He has authored two books on Royal Navy history that I recently read, so I wanted to talk to him about that and maybe just about like writing and what have you in general, I suppose, as well. But I will give a little spiel to give you guys some more background on Mark if you're not acquainted with his channel already or all of his channels, because he seems to have a number of them. But
Okay.
But okay. So Mark joined the Royal Navy in 1980 when he was 16 and very handsome, and served on 3 frigates and in the Gulf 5 times and managed not to sink any of the ships that he served on, which is very impressive. When he
Yeah.
deployed to the Far East for 9 months in 1983-84, he visited New Zealand, and despite his teenage behavior while ashore, he somehow managed to persuade the Kiwi government to let him immigrate there later in life, where he is today as well. And then there were obviously no CCTV cameras back then, but after demobbing and when fully recovered from the door that hit him on the way out, he worked in media and publishing in London, work being a very loose term, more pejorative per Mark, of course. And then before he went to university to do his degree when age 33 and a father of 2. And then it turned out that his children's crayons helped immensely, which I can also testify to that.
Yep.
Similar situation, but although to get to university, excuse me, he had to do night school and sit obliquely beside 15-year-olds who obviously knew more than he did. He studied art, design, theology, and philosophy, and after his many trials and failures, taught in both the UK and New Zealand. Well, he was a warm body in the classroom, and he has written 2 books about the Royal Navy and the Age of Sail, and struggles even now to understand how he did it. We talked about that for a second. And when both books were shortlisted for the UK Maritime Media Awards, he was utterly amazed and not at all surprised when he lost both times. He has completed a 3rd book, a vast, sprawling, rambunctious novel, but sadly knows that it is so far beyond the pale it is doubtful any living agent would ever pick it up, even with tongs. But he is a fervent believer in hope and self-delusion. Therefore, he still believes that he is very handsome. And that might be one of the best biographies I've ever had someone write. So
You did ask for it.
yeah, I haven't interviewed anyone on this channel, and that's something I would be open to doing more. We discussed that just a second ago before recording, but I have interviewed people or hosted meetings that I've introduced people, and no one has ever been quite that quirky with what I asked from them. So very good. Shows your lovely sense of humor. So
Thank you. And welcome.
yeah. So you did already kind of mention this to me before we recorded, but I am interested really what you found appealing about this particular period in naval history and why you decided to go with it. And actually, before you answer that question, I should say he wrote 2 books, mentioned that in his biography. These are the 2 books. Royal Navy, The Napoleonic Age is the second one, and I finished this one pretty recently. I really enjoyed this one, 1800, 1815. But the first one as well is still good. Good preface to the other one. It's 1793 to 1800 with the birth of a superpower. So both very much worthwhile, but that gives you an idea of the period. And so go ahead.
What appeals is the fact that obviously it was in the Navy. And I love history. I love military history. But there's something about the Age of Sail for myself that has always appealed. I love Patrick O'Brien, Master and Commander. That probably had a lot in it. He certainly informed some of the style of the writing, more like a novel. And it's just this romantic, well, it's not, that's the wrong word. It's this almost sense of awe that you can get from studying it, because the war that I'm covering was 22 years, 1793 to 1815. It actually started before 1793. And it's just great uniforms, a lot of daring do. The world still wasn't really known in full. It was a hard existence on a sail ship at the best of times. You throw in war, disease, and storm, it's just this monumental kind of event. that I just felt compelled to write about, more so than any other era that I love. I mean, I love World War II. I love ancient history, Rome. But there's something I thought, I woke up one morning, I thought, I've got to do something about this. Otherwise, I'll go through life and regret never having done it, which is why I approached the publisher in part. So, yeah, it's just, it's got this sense of old world well-to-doness in terms of how they treated people. So even though they were at war for 22 years, you could still have a civil conversation with an enemy. And in fact, there were often these packet ships that would go over from Britain to France and in return, never molested. They would have people going back and forth. You could go to Paris at the height of the war from London, watch the opera, and then go back. It was that kind of era. There was a lot of genteelness to it. And it's just, I don't know, it's just that kind of grand romance of the sea and men against the elements and women against the elements. And I just felt compelled to write about it.
That's fair. Yeah. And while I was reading it, it's almost feels like, time is another country, right? But
Yeah.
it's still in the modern era. Like, it was relatively approachable while still being quite different. So perhaps had that good balance. Definitely something I mentioned to Mark earlier as well, that it's not something I would normally read, if I'm being honest. But I was like, why not? And I enjoyed it. I've been thinking about reading more naval history stuff, to be honest.
Did put you off
because-
then?
No, not completely. But yeah, I think the sea is often romantic, has a romantic feel to it. And now this, of course, was more Navy, not necessarily exploration that you were talking about. And I think I tend to lean towards the age of exploration, like the colonial era, when like discovering New Zealand, or as far as the Brits and I guess Tasman before that, discovering New Zealand. But it's even naval, like, war stuff is, especially when you're the British Navy, because it's America didn't do a lot of discovering with our Navy or anything like that, but the British Navy, the Royal Navy, just is, I don't know how to say it. It's a superpower, essentially. Now, you talk about that in your first book, but it's so dominant. And some of the, I don't know, I guess some of the battle statistics pretty much that you deliver on there, this is chock full of information. Is mind-blowing, if I'm being honest. It was mind-blowing. Like, now, of course, land battle, like Napoleon, when you get to Napoleon's time, is a pretty dominant force on land. But the Brits were just unmatched at sea.
Yeah. Well, it helped the fact that Britain is an island, and it was reliant on merchant shipping. Never used to be. Interestingly, the bit of sea between England and France, known as the Channel to the English, that was seen as a barrier. But for most of the history of the British Isles, when Britain had part of France, it wasn't. It was almost seen like an inland lake. It's only when she was cast loose, when France took over majority of France and we lost Dunkirk, that we became bound by the sea. And to survive as an island, you had to go out, because Britain's okay, but it's not that great in terms of producing stuff. But if you could go out and get that stuff from abroad, you were going to be very wealthy. So mercantilism became a thing for the British. It was go out, get as many colonies, get as much wealth, and you're going to do well as a nation. And when the Bank of England started to support that, and they set up the John Company, the East India Company, Britain became a massive power almost within a generation. And then they saw the wealth that was coming in, and they had to protect it. And therefore, Britain, in modern terms, gave a lot of its GDP, it was never used back then, to support this navy. It was often overlooked, it was often neglected, but generally, although the ships weren't great, they had a fighting prowess. And they also then brought in what was known as the fighting instructions and prize money. And it made ships almost semi-piratical. They would go out and get as many ships as possible. And I think, if you remember, I wrote in the first book about how when they began to win battles and they took ships, they would keep them because they were generally better built. So it was really unforeseen. It was a happy accident as far as the Navy is concerned. But it literally, by the end of the 22 years, it had become the world's largest corporate body. It was huge. You mentioned the Americans. The Americans did knock the stuffing out of the British in the War of 1812. We have to admit that. With only 6 ships, and that was the thing. So Britain always struggled to keep up. There were always others who would literally lead the way in terms of better equipment, better ships. But Britain would effectively not give in. It had this indomitable spirit that was quite unique, often overlooked, but also eventually there were problems as we became more and more powerful, especially when we go into the 19th century and the building up of the empire. But yeah, we were lucky because we were girt by the sea.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, if you're an island nation, you would think you need a relatively competent navy, especially when you have France next door who doesn't like you and such.
Exactly.
But yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, and would you say that, because I think it's about by 1913, Britain's empire is about a quarter of the world.
Yeah.
And do you think it's probably in this period that's really, like, if this didn't happen, if Britain wasn't so dominant during this era, I'm not sure that would be possible by 1930.
No. Sea power led to the empire. I mean, the thing about sea power, it's unique in the fact that, and this is something that Napoleon never understood. He only understood the way land battles occurred. He didn't get the navy. You could project your force long distance so long as you can get ships to the other side of the world. And it became known as gunboat diplomacy in the 1900s, that you just put up a big ship with a load of cannons and pointing to shore and effectively say, if you don't do as we want, you're going to get severely spanked. And that happened a lot. So the only reason that could happen is that Britain had a naval force strong enough to throttle or pressure European nations who were going to go out into the Atlantic, and then go out and keep enough colonies elsewhere that you could get supply, naval rope and wood. It's one of the reasons New Zealand was so important. As I say, the British wanted to get here before the French. And the French were here in part in a place called Akaroa on the South Island. Why here? Because of tall trees, the kauri. There was flax for rope. And if you controlled here, you pretty much controlled most of the Western South Pacific. So that's what Britain did. And it seeded all these little colonies, India, of course, so that when I was growing up, it wasn't so much the case that we still had maps of, the world and all the places that were part of the British Empire. But my parents' generation have been taught that, because the empire only really collapsed in the late 40s, with the release of, or the independence of India under Gandhi. Not under him, it was Nehru by then.
Yeah.
But effectively, the empire began to shrink, but it was like a balloon. It got big, but perhaps too big, too unmanageable. That may be the lesson from the empire. And of course, there's a lot of the add-ons to there, whether the people wanted us to be in the local area and what we brought and what we took away. So, yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting because the only place I've lived overseas is Ghana, and that's a former British colony.
Yeah.
And I can say, I can think of on one hand the amount of people that were angry at me for being a colonizer. Now, I'm not British, but I mean, in many ways, I consider this period of British history my history. I had a lot of British ancestors still living in Britain at this time. My namesake great-great-great-great-grandfather was born in 1800 in Somerset. And along with several other lines still back in Britain or Germany or what have you. But either way, in Ghana, they didn't really care in many ways. In fact, the most common sentiment I met for someone, although I wasn't, again, British, I was American, they were like, oh, yeah, you guys taught us everything we knew. Like, everything we know was taught by you guys. And I was like, that's interesting. Now, Ghanaians are very positive people from my general experience. And if that doesn't give you an idea of that, then I don't know necessarily what will, but they were very, very friendly. Didn't really have much in the way of animosity towards the British, although I know that definitely happened. And of course, the British weren't always benevolent, hosts or members of the society that they were participating in. But it's still I thought that was curious, and I found that interesting. But I don't tend to think about New Zealand being strategically located, generally speaking, just because it's so out of the way.
Mm.
And I knew that there were some, like, of course, like some French involvement, and I know they have French Polynesia.
Yeah.
To this day, I think it's still a protectorate or something, right?
Yeah.
But that is definitely something. But just thinking of like as things as far flung as New Zealand, and you mentioned this with like wood and rope, is such a logistical nightmare. Just the fact that they kept such a large fleet afloat, I think, is almost miraculous. Like it just gives you an idea of how many people were involved with such operations. I am
You're
curious. Oh, sorry. You have some.
sorry, you are correct, and that's something that's I wanted to talk about in the books specifically. So when you read naval history, especially, it's written as though all that matters are the ships and how they lined up and the battles. Nothing so much historically about the victuals, the way in which they had to be constantly replenished and repaired. But more importantly, then the people, the civilians who supported such a huge enterprise, they're mainly always overlooked. The people who work the dockyards, the farmers who had to provide the cattle to be made into beef cuts for the navy. It doesn't exist. It could not exist on its own. So I certainly wanted to talk about the fact that it's not just a naval endeavor, it's a national endeavor, especially at the scale and size in which the Royal Navy was. And it is today. I mean, the United States Navy isn't just ships, it's all the things that feed into it, all the economy of providing materials from people who probably doesn't live anywhere near the sea. So that's the thing that I personally definitely wanted to talk about, because in my own experience reading about it, you'd struggle, especially when talking about the Age of Sail, to find that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And you actually, you were really good about, and while you're in your book, saying like, the cost, like cost kept increasing as the Navy was getting bigger, but obviously that
Yeah.
money's not coming from nowhere,
Right.
And I thought your perspectives were really unique, but I felt helped really humanize it, even if they're fictional characters, right? But that narrative device, to be honest, is not something I'm used to. I mentioned Master and Commander. I have not read that, or what book it's based on. I don't know if it's actually called Master and Commander. I can't remember.
It is, yeah, the first book in the series.
Oh, okay. I've seen the film. It's a good film, but the was it a similar device that he uses then?
No, he just writes a novel, but he does a lot of stream of consciousness. In other words, we know who the people are, he names them, but then he'll have them talking. The device you're talking about is that in each chapter, you tend to get almost like a novel, although someone was there, often not named, and that's deliberate, because an interesting fact about this era is that a lot of the muster books what would tell us who were serving on those ships are lost. They probably went down with the ship. They were lost in a battle. We don't know vast amount of people who ever served. And we certainly don't know the names of people who were civilians. So if you're going to talk about them, you can give a name, but what does that prove? So they tend, for myself, to be nameless, or you don't get the full name, and they are representing somebody who was there and how they would feel. Because again, and I'm just going to go slightly off here, I'll give you an example of when I have an interest in World War II and Operation Barbarossa, when Nazi Germany invaded Russia. You can get books with massive maps and all these big arrows showing where all the divisions swept in, and it will say how many tanks and how many men fought or lost. But you never get to hear about the people that may have been slightly behind the lines but were part of that army. And you certainly very rarely get to hear about the civilians who had to suffer all of this. So imagine writing a book about them. That's what I wanted to do about this era. But you could name them, but really, if you're going to name somebody who was real, well, you don't know what their thoughts were. So I thought, well, I'm going to write somebody who's fictitious, and I'm open about that. But they give the ideas of what they may have felt like at that time, because otherwise it's just a dry account. And over 2 books is going to get pretty boring very quickly, I felt. So I wanted to make it as though we could understand how people felt, because at the end of the day, it's all about people and it's all about emotions. They're not dry, they're not literally robotic. They would have been scared, they would have been under pressure, either on the ships or at land, because their loved ones were serving. They probably went away for years, never came back. And you mentioned earlier about time. I'm very keen to talk about the passing of time and how things changed by the end of it. And death. I have people who are injured and facing mortality. Well, that doesn't need to know who it is, because if we name it and we say this is the person, I think you're kind of distancing yourself. Oh, that happened to them back then. But if it's like in this vacuous sense of time, it could be us, it could be our sisters, it could be our brothers. And that's why I chose that style. Didn't appeal to everybody, because if you're used to reading books in a certain way, this is different.
Yeah, and I will say it was different. These were the first books I've ever read like that. I know there was a review on Amazon when I was adding them to my wish list that was complaining about that.
Yeah.
So I could see it not being for everyone, but I think that it's pretty much like what you said. It seemed like it humanized it. Now, even without giving the names, I didn't think that was a problem. But it was because you get a lot of information. This is nonfiction. You get a lot of concrete, like, information. You could almost say statistics with all the numbers you're throwing out. But it was still felt very personable. Almost feel like, give it practically firsthand accounts without actually being a real person. But if it could have been, that seemed very probable, very likely. And of course, because there were, of course, people that had firsthand accounts, even if we don't have them. I actually read a book just like the other day, just after this, which was actually a similar device, and I was like, oh, I kind of know what to expect from this now because I just read Mark's books. But that was a Kiwi book. It was The Periaka Woman by Witi Ihi Maeda or something. I don't actually remember his last name, but it was similar too. It was a real event, but he told the story through fictional characters. He did give them names and stuff like that, but it's an interesting device, and one I'm not against reading more of. Although, again, I could see people just feeling like it's not for them. It's like, is it nonfiction or is it a novel? I don't know. But
there is another thing as well, is that when you're limited to the amount of words and you've got to get a lot of information, when you get fictional characters and you're talking about their inner thoughts, stream of consciousness, you can drop in a lot of stuff and then chop and change. You can go all over the place. I did that towards the end about, if you remember, the lawyer in Plymouth, and he's thinking about the book he read and all these facts. Rather than just giving you the facts, it's somebody threading it all together. And that way, I could save 2 or 3 pages of information just by a quick inward thinking about this happened, that happened, and then move on. Yeah. And it made it a lot easier to include a lot of information.
Yeah, and that's just how, like, when you're talking to people, right? I'm not going to read 3 pages straight off the book. I'm just going to remember what I tell you. I'm going to give you the information real quick. Right. I'm going to give you what you know. And yeah, I think that's a fair point as well, because these books are not long, all things considered. But I felt like I came out of them with a lot of information, despite them being short. And normally, if I see a nonfiction book and it's this short, even though this is just like notes, I'm kind of like, am I going to get enough out of this? Because compared to some of these other nonfiction books, like this one's on the Vikings, and it's just like, really thick one. But that did not happen. I mean, and I think that can be, even if it's not chock full of information, I think you can have nonfiction books that are, relatively small. But it was not a huge time commitment, but I still got a lot out of it. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And now you mentioned how, well, we kind of just talked about, even if they were unnamed, these more personable characters from different walks of life, from just that are somehow involved, right? Even if they live in Plymouth, and the guy's probably not ever on a boat, but he lives in Plymouth, so he's going to be aware of these things anyway, or more likely to be aware of these things, I imagine. There are bigger names that people know, like we mentioned Napoleon and Nelson, like someone like Nelson. Uh, it's hard to not be interested in those people in many ways, I think. Maybe that's Nelson's a good example too, because he is, I don't really ever hear anything bad about Horatio Nelson, like I don't think I've ever heard any bad things about him. But he's a war hero, and not everyone's interested in war, right? But why do you think we like Nelson? I mean, you talk about Nelson a bit.
He upset people above him, and he upset some of the people on the same level because he was given preference over others who felt that they'd been in the Navy long enough to have got a step up when he got it. And of course, in wartime, what tends to happen is if you're good at what you do, you're going to be given a group of ships, a squadron to go off and play with. I think, it's. I don't think I said this in the book, but it's something that I've become aware of recently, and it's to do with other things. And it's going to sound crass and it's going to sound awful. I apologize. And thankfully, 2 centuries have gone by, so I don't think Nelson's going to complain. He had the good grace to die young. He died a hero's death at the most pivotal battle that Britain ever had. If he'd have died in his sleep a month before, I don't think we'd be talking about him. He would have been seen or lost to history as another admiral who had a good run, a bit like others, Howe and St. Vincent. There were others that we could be talking about, but he happened to be there and died a hero's death at the time of Trafalgar. And that became the almost crutch point for the whole of this 22 years of the Navy. Because up until that point, there weren't many great battles. They all tend to be small ships fighting each other. That's something about master and commander. They're all small ships harrowing a lot of merchantmen and some ships that dare to come out, because the French pretty much bottled themselves up in ports for most of this conflict. They weren't stupid. They weren't going to come out and destroy themselves during a time of revolution when all their money was going on land warfare. So the Brits had to make the most of it. And he was involved in this huge thing that was very magnified afterwards. And I think we're in a period now where he has become seen as a hero. And possibly along the lines of, there's a guy called Peter Gale, Dutchman, who was in a concentration camp in the war. And when he was in concentration camp, he spent his time thinking about a book he could write. And it's, Viktor Frankl?
Yeah.
He wrote a book after the war, Man's Search for Meaning. And he said, people in concentration camps, it wasn't the big buff types that survived. It's the ones who could foresee a positive future and that they would be free. So he survived, Peter Gale, and he wrote about Napoleon, but how he was seen by the French at different periods. And I think it's the same, you could say, at his time, he was revered, then he was hated when he fell. And then when another Napoleon came to power, he was glorified again, and so on, up and down, up and down. And it's the same with Nelson. He, for a long stretch, has been on the up. But of course, when we went through that period of knocking down statues and stuff, some people have begun to reevaluate what he is. I think he's still seen as a hero because he had a lot of daring do. But as a person, he could be quite arrogant, and he upset a lot of people, especially on the diplomatic stage when he had an affair out in Italy. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother topic we could talk about, really, is like if we're gonna knock down statues for someone who wasn't perfect, then we're not gonna have any statues, pretty much. So and some of course are more egregious in their crimes, I suppose, or what have you. I think is Nelson on the South Island of New Zealand is named after Lord
Yes,
Nelson.
that's right, yeah. And lovely little town north of the South Island.
Yeah, and it's like, because it's a region of itself, but it's essentially just a town, I think, which is very small. But either way, everything in New Zealand seems relatively small, if I'm being honest, compared to American populations.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But even compared to British populations, I can imagine New Zealand's kind of quaint. If just
5 million.
yeah, that's like Houston, where I've lived before. So
London's got more people.
yeah, that London's massive, to be honest. But either way, and I guess yeah, I mean, I almost think that people that don't see people like this as heroes don't think about them otherwise. They tend to not think about Nelson until it's brought to their attention that he's a bad guy and then they need to do something about it. The people that actually think about Nelson, I think there would be a relative consensus that he's a hero. Even if he's imperfect, of course, you should be willing to recognize nuanced characteristics and whatnot, but just easier said than done. But either way, and because another figure that I tend to look at as a hero, and this isn't, you didn't talk about him in these books really because he wasn't the subject, but Cook, Captain Cook.
Yes.
I tend to see him as a hero as well, and he's part of that like exploration, that romance of the sea in many ways. And he I don't know if I would say he was a heroic death, but he still died exploring in American what is now American territory, but Hawaii. But I still see him as kind of this heroic figure, so like Nelson. And I
Well,
think
of course,
it's okay
in war, you need heroes.
Yeah.
Or heroines. You need them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've never been in war. I guess I could say, so I don't know from firsthand experience, but yeah, you definitely need heroes. In fact, I think it's just good to have heroes, generally speaking, people that you can look up to. It's almost like having saints if you're religious, right? Having these people that you can look to for examples, whether it's for their religious piety, like whatever they did, or it's for their courage and their bravery and what have you, during war times. So, in the odd case where they're like a warrior saint, which has happened, although I'm not too aware of those types. I would have friends that know more about that. But either way, you've talked about why this period of naval history was why you were drawn to it, I should say. If you could write on any other period in perhaps Royal Navy history, would you want to write perhaps more about the Falkland War, or like, do you have one in mind or something? Or
good question. Probably, if it was to be the Navy, it would be the Navy before the Navy. It would be the Armada, but that's so overdone. What I'm really interested in those pieces of history, they're often overlooked. So it may be the small wars, as they became known throughout the Victorian era. Crimea would be one, and so yeah, that would probably be it. But if it wasn't Navy, probably similar, but about a grander scale, say World War I or World War II. Not so much the Falklands. So when the Falklands happened, I was on HMS Aurora. I wanted to transfer over to a ship, but couldn't. I was not old enough. That was the Coventry, which was hit and sunk a couple of weeks later, 3 weeks later. So we went out the Gulf. And that was a war zone because Iran and Iraq were at war at that time. We had a thing called the Armilla Patrol. And it's too close for me. I'd be talking about a period in which people I know didn't come back. So it's not something that I would write, because plus the fact I went through it. And that would be one period in history I would hate to recount, just in case I got it wrong. Because there'll be people around who'd say, no, hang on, that's not right. So,
yeah, that's fair.
It's difficult.
Yeah, and I think there would definitely be some Argentinians that would be upset with you, but that might happen regardless.
And that's another thing, to see it from their point of view as well.
Yeah, that I've never thought about that, because my family, when I was in high school, we had an Argentinian exchange student. Very proud of his country. And I think they are to this day. Whenever I hear anything about the Falklands today, it's Argentinians being very salty about it. So that's an interesting point. And I guess I can see what you're saying. I've never experienced something like that. The most unique experience I've had was being a missionary, and I've thought about maybe writing on something like that. I don't know if anyone besides members in my own church would be interested in reading stuff like that, but okay, we have one. But the Crimea, I'm not super acquainted with that Crimean War, but I believe it was one of the, if not like maybe the first photographed war. Um,
Ooh, yeah, could be. Well, that's a good point. I'd have to look that up. Keep talking. I'm just going to do
because
some research.
so I may be misremembering because I was a teaching assistant for several classes while I was an undergrad, and one of them was a history of photography course. And we looked at war photographs, especially American Civil War, because they did not censor it whatsoever.
Mm.
And which is something we definitely do these days. But we're looking at early war photography, and I believe sounds about right. If Crimea was not the first photographed war, it was one of the first. The other ones would have been like the Boxer Rebellion and things like that. Some other ones we don't tend to talk too much about in American history, but
Yeah, I thought so. Because the Crimean was the 1850s, so it was the American-Mexican War, 1840s, late 40s. That has some photographs. So it's slightly a bit earlier. But you're right. It was that era in which we began to demystify war because it was always what we heard from others. Well, there was never any photographic evidence for so long, especially in the age of sail. They tended to be written by superior officers. We don't get much accounts of the men or the women that served on the ships. That's half the problem. And it's always after the event and sometimes many months afterwards. So they can be skewed in people's memories and what is said. So with the advent of photography, it added a new kind of realism. And what's interesting when you look at the photographs, especially of the Civil War, like Antietam and all that, the graphic nature upset a lot of people because they didn't, in their mind, a war was glorious.
yeah,
They didn't want to see dead horses and dead bodies in mud, that kind of stuff. So interesting.
yeah, it's photography and war is something that I'm perhaps more acquainted with, even though I didn't know the first war. And Mexican-American War makes perfect sense thinking about the timeline there. Yeah, I remember learning about people didn't know what war was in many ways, right?
Still
Uh,
don't.
yeah, and that's fair. In many ways, I would say I don't know what war is, although I like to think I have perhaps a better idea because I've studied just things about like that, generally speaking. But Matthew Brady, one of I believe he was British, but he was British American photographer during the American Civil War. I think it might have been the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, but I can't
Right.
remember
Yeah.
exactly. Went to photograph it, and he said there were people like sitting at picnics to watch the battle, and while he's
Yeah.
sitting there to photograph it, and then it's just like turns into a bloodbath, and everybody just starts running for the hills, and
Yeah.
it's like you guys have no idea what you're doing. In fact, apparently he ended up getting lost in the woods for a couple of days before they found him because he just left his camera and he was out of there because he was like, what in the world is going on? And I don't think he
Yeah.
went to a battlefield after that, at least not an active battlefield.
Mm.
But yeah, just people people don't understand a lot of things, and I of course I'm guilty of this too. But war is not something a lot of people I think really want to understand in many ways, and I don't blame them in many ways. But
Where I was living in the UK before we came to New Zealand, Plymouth, they have a thing called the Lamb Feast, which is on ground outside an old Norman, it's just a mound now, castle.
mm,
You wouldn't know it was a castle, but it's just like a hill. And they had a reenactment of two guns, and they weren't very big, cannon. And my daughter, she would have been about 2.5, 3, took her along, and this thing went off. She was some distance from it. She didn't stop running for some distance away from it. I had to run and get her just in case she ran across a road. I mean, it's frightening. They say, could you imagine being confined in a space where the noise is magnified? That's the thing about the old sailing ships. And there's a whole lot of cannon on one side going off, 8, 16 guns or something like that. After the Battle of Trafalgar, a lot of the men were deaf,
mm,
not just injuries, and they're frightening. And I remember being on frigates and the Bofors gun going off, and I was standing next to them, and the force and the sound was horrible. It's not pleasant. No, not for everyone.
yeah, I can imagine. I don't know how I would respond to that. The loudest thing I've heard was like a sonic boom going off nearby, and that was like it was. I had to stop. I lived in Florida near Port Canaveral, and we were
Wow.
miles and miles away though still. But when the sonic boom came out, like the whole house just started shaking, and I was like, what is going on? Like, are we being invaded? And so I can imagine, like, when you're right near explosives, pretty much things firing off, that I don't know. I don't. I read stories about people almost losing their mind, or getting down on the fetal position and stuff like that when
Yeah.
situations like this. It's like, yeah, it explains things. So
Yeah, Goethe wrote about it at the Battle of Valmy, 1792, and he was there with the Prussians and the Austrians. He must have been very close to the cannon. It became known as the Cannonade of Valmy. The French won that battle, but a lot of rain, a lot of disease. The Germans lost. But he said afterwards that a red mist descended over him. I actually used that in one of my books. The red mist, because he must have been so close to the cannon that the little things in his eyes must have burst. He would have literally seen blood. And that's quite common, the red mist. And you just lose all sense of, it must have been in shock as well.
yeah, I can imagine. That's not something it's just human history, I suppose, but not a necessarily pretty part of human history. And there is a question I actually wrote down. Don't know if you have an answer for it, because I'm not sure I have an answer for it in many ways.
Okay.
What do you think you could say, maybe what makes a war just or unjust?
I don't think that, well, there's, okay, the just war argument, and you can give any references to it as you wish. Ultimately, if you follow the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself, there is no justification for war. Full stop. But one of the things that Eisenhower said to the men before they went to D-Day, he said, this is like a crusade. We are doing this to help people in Europe. And a lot of men consequently died. Now, was that loss of life just to stop an injustice? I think the word could be, debatable, but you either don't do anything. And often, like in schools, we say, if you see a bully picking on another child and you do nothing, you're just as culpable. Sometimes you are equally culpable by not getting involved or trying to stop it. Or do you do something? Now, I would argue that force against force is never justifiable, but sometimes you've got no option. If you're invaded and you want to survive, you've got to do something. You could just give up, roll over, and perhaps that could be argued as something. But ultimately, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think it was not Goebbels, Goering said just before he ended his life at Nuremberg, is that history is written by the victor. And generally, they're the ones who justify that wars had to happen. So it's a fantastic question. I've got no answer myself. But I would say, what did FDR say? He said that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you'd lend them a hose. Hence the Lend-Lease in World War II, which Britain only finished off paying in 2005. It was such a vast amount of money.
Long enough, I suppose. Yeah,
it's right. Was that justifiable? Well, if it was to end tyranny, possibly, yes.
Yeah, my thoughts are actually pretty similar to yours, I would say. I think any war, just like pretty much any death, is tragic. But there are things that it's like, I don't know, like if you're going just to line the pockets of the aristocracy, then it's kind of like, but like if you're going to help people, I feel like that's relatively just. It's still tragic that you might feel inclined to do that. Or feel like you have to, because a shadow is going to fall over the whole continent or something like that. But I don't know. It's hard to think about. I hope to never be in a situation where I have to make such decisions. But
could I just add something? Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm reading at the moment the history of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, and he talks about the greatest problem he thought with World War I were the speculators who wished to continue it, so they made money. the people who are providing the armaments. And that perhaps is the real tragedy of war.
Mhm.
There are people who will try to become wealthy through it. Anyway, that's just a little
Yeah,
add-on.
I think that's what a lot of American government figures are. We call them war hawks. That's they
Yeah.
make money off of it, and so they're
Yeah.
okay. And even if it's against the will of the people they represent, they don't really care in many ways. It's about if you, in many ways, it's kind of like, can you convince them to be with us so we can get the money? That's again another can of worms, perhaps, but still, it's something, because if someone comes into my house, I value my family's life more than I value their life.
Yes.
But it's still something that I would absolutely not want to do. And I'd rather that never happens. It hasn't, and I hope it never does. But still, something I think at the moment you tend to not think about it though. Like if someone comes into my family's house, you take care of it, and just like I guess in many ways, if it's invading your nation, you try to stop them. But that's. I have one more question. It's not really related to the books necessarily, but you did mention in the bio, I should say, a third novel or book, and I'm just curious if you could write on anything that wasn't Royal Navy or just naval or maybe even sea focused. What would you want to write on?
Well, the novel just happens to be set in the Age of Sail on a ship because it takes the character away from home. That's the whole point.
Mm.
If everything's taken away from you, he's press ganged and he was betrayed, and he's a young man, he's 16, and he knows nothing about the sea, and it's a rough place. He's on a battered old ship. But the only reason that was set is that you don't get that equivalent today. So he goes off to places he'd never heard of. He has no idea how a ship's run. He's beaten about. He's ignored. How do you survive? How do you put up with that? And he's in utter despair. And the book really is two things. It's about how he overcomes that from darkness to light, post Tenebras looks after darkness light. How does he come out by being a better person and then forgiving the woman who betrays him? Mm. And it's in the Age of Sail. And the one thing that's often misunderstood with that is that there were women who went to sea gladly. And he meets a woman, and despite having been betrayed by women, and at that point not liking them, he comes to like the woman, and then how they help each other. That's the only thing. To be honest, I'm happy to write anything in any context so long as it's emotional. I tend to be, I think, when I was writing the second one, you rightly said off air that it's your preferred book, and I think you're correct, because the first one was more technical. It had to be talking about the ships and how they're built. Once you've done that, you can't rinse and repeat. So this one's more about emotions. And I enjoyed it more writing. It probably shows in the writing. And I thought for the third one, I'd like to expand it so it's just a novel like the introductory bits of each chapter, and then just see how far I can take it. So that could be in any situation. But it's really, how do you put up with having a terrible, dark period in your life and then coming out of it? And I think I was swayed by the fact that I went through the dark night of the soul myself. And I've drawn on that to talk about this character. And I hope I answered your question. I think I did.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that would be interesting. I would read it if you published it. My twin brother just published. He self-published. Because getting a traditional publisher can be difficult. It might limit your audience in many ways. But I don't know. My brother had been sitting on this story for a while, and our little brother, our younger brother, he's not really little. He's 16 months younger than us. But he decided, it's like, man, like, just publish it. Like, who cares? Just throw it to Amazon and you'll get it published real quick. And even if it doesn't sell that much, at least you have something to get started with a career. I know you already have some books published, of course, but if you publish it, I'll read it and I'll make a video on my channel for my like 140 subscribers or whatever. So
well, that's good. Thank you.
But yeah, so those are actually all the questions I had. I appreciate your time. I hope it was okay. But at the same time, I can say to the viewers again, if you're interested, go read these books, The Royal Navy, that Mr. Jessop wrote, Mr. Book Ramble himself. And if you don't feel like buying books right now, then go check out his channel. You have a couple videos that are on like sailors too, that Mr. Nagel.
Yeah. Oh, what a life he had. He had Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Nagel, unbelievable. Now, again, if you James A. Michener, American author, he wrote about him, and he said if I wrote a character like him, the publisher would say no way, it's impossible. But is accredited for all the things he did. It's amazing.
Yeah, that one seems super interesting. That's one that I was like, I might want to try to find a copy of that book or something. But either way, go check out Mark's channel. I'll have his channel linked below, and maybe I'll get another interview for the channel at some point. I have no idea as of right now, but either way. So I'll see you guys next time. Please feel free to like and to subscribe, and have a good one.
Ta-ta for now.